Good morning, everybody. This is Stephen Pugh of the Home Bible College. I want to do a book review today on a wonderful book, which is the sort of book which is so completely life-changing that since I first had a copy of this, and this was a very, very long time ago, probably 30 years ago, that I have always had this book at my side, and I've read it probably every summer holiday for all these years. Okay, you say, what sort of book is that? Well, it's a book by J.C. Ryle called The Christian Leaders of the 18th Century, J.C. Ryle. Now, there are various forms of this book that have come out, and the one that I want to particularly recommend is by Banner of Truth Trust. It's by J.C. Ryle, Doctor of Divinity, and the one I want to recommend is the full version. There are smaller versions with certain people omitted, but there is a full version. That's the point. The people mentioned, first of all, he talks about the religious and moral condition of England at the beginning of the 18th century. He talks about the agency by which Christianity was revived in England in the middle of the 18th century. He talks about William Grimshaw of Haworth. He talks about William Romaine. He talks about Daniel Rowlands, John Berridge, Henry Venn, George Whitefield, and John Wesley. Now, that's not the order in which they appear in the book that contains all of their names, but this particular one is an earlier version with some of the people missing. So I just want to bring that to your attention. And some people may think, well, how bad was it in those days? In the beginning of the 18th century, things were particularly bad. In fact, some research was done. It was found that most of the Church of England ministers were unable to explain the means of salvation. Most of them there were no Bible societies, there were no missionaries, there were no Sunday schools. It's very hard to imagine life in those days. There was a spirit of slumber that had come across the land, and it had almost become a given that nobody ever read the Bible anymore, nobody ever preached the scriptures, and nobody ever really believed in God anymore. So what was the great thing that transformed England in those days, and America, may I say? It was the old-fashioned apostolic weapon of preaching. That's what did it. It was prayer and the ministry of the word. It was nothing other than a revival. They preached everywhere. They literally preached everywhere. They preached simply. Everybody could understand. They preached fervently and directly. They didn't talk about us and we. They said, I have come to talk to you. They talked simply. They preached simply. They believed in the sufficiency and the supremacy of the Holy Scriptures. That's what they believed. They believed in the complete corruption of the human nature and the inability of a person to save themselves. They also believed that it was upon the death of Christ on the cross that the only satisfaction for man's sin has been made. They believed and they preached justification by faith alone, in Christ alone. They preached the universal necessity of a new birth, of a spiritual transformation. They talked about the connection between real faith and real holiness. That was very important. And so in truth, they preached God's eternal hatred against sin and God's eternal love to the sinner. Wow. So this was absolutely life transforming. Now, you may never have read a book like this. I suggest you try to get hold of a copy. If you're unable to get hold of a copy of this, you will have failed to really understand something of what God can do and what God has done. The men that are described, are still our examples today. John Wesley, George Whitefield, William Grimshaw, William Romaine, Daniel Rowlands, John Berridge, and Henry Venn. What great men of God they are. And a book like this, if you're a preacher and if you're a teacher, if you're a pastor, if you're an evangelist, get this book. Become fired up. Become fired up. Become fired up by learning about what God can do in a period of time when the English-speaking world was in a doldrums. And these men, all by themselves, in the power of the Spirit, they transformed Western society. And it was the preaching of the gospel. It was the old-fashioned gospel. It was the preaching of the gospel. It was men of prayer, and it was men of preaching. They believed in preaching. They all took to the streets. They took to the open air. They took their message outside the church doors. Most of the time, the church doors were shut to them. Most of them were Church of England ministers. Okay? But often the church doors were shut to them. And let me tell you about one dear, dear man of God. Tell you one little story about him, and we'll see what happens. See what you think. William Grimshaw was an absolutely outstanding man of God. He lived in the little village of Haworth in Yorkshire. He was the vicar there. And on one occasion the bishop had so many bad reports about him that he decided he would visit him and he would find out what's going on. And he came to see him and he said, right, I'm going to take over the service. You prepare the people, and then you're going to preach on a subject that I give you, and then I'm going to talk to you afterwards. When he spoke to him afterwards, he said, how many people were in this church when you came? And he said, oh, just 12. He said, how many people do you have now? He said, well, in the summer it's about 12,000, and in the winter it's about half that. And the bishop said, I don't have a quarrel with you. I don't have a quarrel with you. Don't have a quarrel. What absolutely outstanding men of God. And if you're a preacher, if you're an open air preacher, go and read about these men. Find out what made them tick. Because may I say, we're not living in days as bad as those days. Not at all. Not by any stretch of our... People say that the day we're living in is the worst we've ever had. I don't believe that. No, I believe that we've had periods of time that were much darker than what we are today. However, the gospel is still the same. Conversion is still the same. People are still the same. They need to be saved in just the same way. Go and read about these men. Find out how they did it. Find out what they did. They did two things. They prayed and they preached. God bless you. Look forward to speaking to you next time. Bye for now.